Okay, welcome everyone. A few people will keep entering, but we'll get started because there is quite a lot to go through tonight, which we were just discussing. And so we will, but if we find that we're sort of rushing through the information and we get to the end and there's lots of questions and stuff like that, please feel free to email them through to us, and Brett and I together can answer them. Well, I can answer them or ask Brett or whoever to get the information so that we can get that to you. But we'll do our best to be as comprehensive as possible tonight. So tonight, essentially, we're going to look at the different home and living options, and the difference between the different NDIS options. And we're also going to talk about the home and living funding, what's included. And then we're also going to touch on how do we get there if we've identified that we want to live independently, what are the steps in applying for that funding? So tonight I am presenting. So I'm Alex and one of the senior support coordinators at Fighting Chance, and I also do recovery coaching and access. And Brett, who is the general manager of BASE, which is the housing enterprise of Fighting Chance. So Brett, do you want to say hi?
Hello, everybody.
So Brett has kindly said that he will join, and so when we ask questions, Brett can jump in, and I also saw that Tanya's on here too, which she also works at Fighting Chance, and Ali, of course. So Ali's going to be managing the chat. She will get the questions from the chat, and any tech issues and stuff. Ali will make sure that she's watching the chat there. I've pressed record, so it will be recorded and uploaded on our website if anyone wants to watch that later or wants to share with anyone to watch later. So we start, like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So we're starting from the start, and essentially starting from the bit of when you're thinking that you want to move out and you sort of whatever stage you are at in life, but you're thinking that you want to move out of the family home or move out of where you are and live independently, but maybe there has been a barrier there or a challenge there for you or your loved one due to the disability that they have met access for on the scheme. There are many options, including both mainstream and NDIS. For someone to be eligible for NDIS, there needs to be, the mainstream options needs to be essentially explored. And the NDIA, your support coordinator, and if you don't have a support coordinator, we'll talk about this a bit later, but if you don't have a support coordinator, when it comes to exploring housing options, having a support coordinator through the process and requesting that is pretty essential at the way that the NDIA is at the moment. And your OT, so the occupational therapist, is another person that's essential in this process. And then, of course, informal supports and other supports to help to transition into a home and living option that's right for you.
Sorry, can I just cut in there?
Yeah,
Alex,
of course.
are you sharing some slides?
Oh, I am. I'm
not seeing them.
I am sharing my slides. Is anyone else not seeing them?
No, can't see them, I'm afraid.
Oh, sorry, guys. Thanks, Brett. So
there we go.
That's better.
Okay. So we just went through this slide. There are, so when it comes to housing, there are the different options. So there's the mainstream options, and then there are NDIS options. So, and this is what we're going to be talking about tonight. So we'll be talking about mainstream options, FDA, assistive technology, home modifications. We're also going to be touching on supported independent living, individualized living options, and flexible core supports. Oh, sorry. So we're going to start with mainstream housing options. So these are the things that need to be explored and essentially identified that they're not suitable, or they're not suitable on their own for the individual, you as an individual, or the individual that is that, like, your loved one that you're listening to this about tonight. So some of the mainstream options are family-owned home, public housing, private rental, sharing with friends, or home sharing. So it might be the case that there is a combination of mainstream and NDIS support that is required, which is that way for a lot of people. And the OT doing the housing assessment will assess all options and write in their recommendations. When they write in their report, they need to be identifying all of the options, so both mainstream and NDIS, and essentially going through why each of them will not be suitable, and then why the right one is suitable. So it's really important in their report that they go through all of the options. Oh, sorry. The next one that we're going to talk about, or the first NDIS support that we're going to talk about, is supported independent living, which is one that you've probably heard a lot. It's also known as SIL, so the acronym for supported independent living. So essentially, supported independent living is the support. It's not the home, it's the support in the home. So it is the support workers that are coming in, and it's for people who need support pretty much 24/7. So minus their, if they're going to a day program or something during the day, but sort of on outside times of that, in the mornings, in the evenings, and overnight, that they're requiring that support. This may be the most appropriate option for them. So it's paid personal support, and most commonly used in shared living arrangements. So more than one person in the home. That's not saying that some people get SIL for just one person occupancy, but more often than not, there's more than one person in the SIL environment. I'm just trying to move sorry guys, I can't see. Sorry. Oh, there we go. So what support is covered in SIL? So it's the person-to-person support, essentially. So that is the support workers, and they are providing the supervision, safety, and security for the individual. They can provide support with personal care tasks, support with tasks such as meal prep, cooking, cleaning, routine development. We want to see it as, and ideally we want it to be, that active support. So and that person-centered active support is what we want to see the support workers providing. So it's not a hotel, it's not it's their living environment, and we want to see the support workers supporting the individuals to build those skills as much as possible, in a way that's not pushing them so far that they're set up to fail that task, but that they're there as a support to do with rather than for. So that's really encouraged in the SIL model, because we want to build independent living skills, or SIL providers should be building independent living skills, not sort of taking them away. And some families, like we've had families come in and they've been like, it's a weird concept because we're putting supports in the house. And so, but we want them to live independently. But I guess the purpose of it is we want them to live independently, but we want them to remain safe. So it's that balance. They can also provide behavior support and social skill development. This isn't as behavior support practitioners, but it's about implementing behavior support plans or supporting building social skills that they might be learning in therapy. So again, that capacity building. They can administer medications and support for medical appointments, and also organizing like trips or anything outside, like birthday parties or social events and stuff. The SIL home or the SIL house manager or the support workers in the house would be supporting with those things as well. And then what is not covered? So everyday living expenses. So if you think about it as as that, then you can kind of start to rule out the things that aren't going to be covered. So rent, the utilities, groceries, any bills and stuff, that's not going to be covered by NDIS. Other funded support such as transport, regular community access, therapy, employment support. The support workers that go, if they are support workers that are outside the home, so they're community support workers, they are not funded through SIL. So they're still funded in the same area that SIL funding gets put in core, but it is still under that community access, social and community participation funding. Personal care supports while the participant is in hospital. They can't be coming into the hospital. In saying that though, if there is a situation where someone is in hospital and there are that it's not so much personal care supports, but in such as like a little bit of that sort of familiar social support to come and visit and stuff, those things are okay if it's okay by the hospital. But yeah, they wouldn't be coming in to do that individual's personal care because that's the hospital's responsibility. Ongoing costs and supports for vacancy, which is built into the price limit. Specific funding for staff to attend training for the participant support needs. So those two things actually, and organizational management costs, vehicle costs and shadow shifts, these last bits, they're not covered by NDIS. And so what that actually becomes is that actually becomes a cost for the SIL provider. And Brett can talk to that very much better than me, but that means that the SIL provider is having to cover those costs. Brett, do you want to add? Oh, why is that one? Oh, here. Do you want to add anything here in terms of this? What's not covered, or even what is covered?
No, just pick up on your last comment there. It's sort of, yeah, they're not. It does come out of the funding effectively. So we bill and they allow a certain percentage for some of this sort of stuff, but they never allow enough for what the real costs of providing that is. And there's no real, they allow for it under sort of what they call the overheads or operational costs of the SIL provider. So it's a bit of a mix, but just never enough.
And it's minimal, but there's no like line item for these things to like that line item or anything. So Brett is, I'm going to get Brett to talk about this slide because he knows it very, very well. So I will hand over to you, Brett.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Yeah, so here we're just going to introduce, I guess, what some of the key or main SIL models are, and I just picked on 3 examples. So these are sort of looking at one extreme to the other, and then something in between. And there are different models out there that sort of can vary a little bit on each of these, but this will give you a good idea. Starting with what they call the full family governance model. And that's essentially, as it says there, where families of housemates come together and generally form some sort of legal entity. Oftentimes it's a cooperative or something like that. And through that, they then manage the full operation of the house. So that is everything from HR, so human resources, so hiring, firing, performance management, paying the salaries, etc. So you've got your financial management, that's then around your or paying the bills, doing your tax, all the sort of stuff that goes around operating a legal entity. Training of staff. There's quite a bit of compliance involved with partly training from a duty of care perspective, as well as just meeting compliance requirements. IT, anything and everything that you can think of. And that's basically operated by the families, and they manage that whole process themselves. So the positives of that is that you get a lot of high choice and control, because generally the families and the participants, housemates, are involved. The negative for some is that there's a lot of work involved with that, and not everybody is in a position to be able to put that amount of time in, or have the skills, or whatever it might be, to continue on that. And then you also just have to consider the sustainability of that model going forward, past the ability of the existing family governance members to participate. So that's sort of at the most end. I'll go to the last one, provider governance. That sort of gives you the opposite end of the scale, if you like, and that's where the SIL provider is effectively runs the show and everything. There's no real formal structure to allow for the involvement of families or housemates in it. Depending on the provider, there may be some informal methods and by which they gain input, and of course they are trying to seek input and meet the needs of the housemates, but they're far less what's the word, I guess, flexible. They're working to tighter controls, which are probably more around how they manage their rosters and things like that, and trying to manage costs. And it's just not. It just doesn't give you as much options to be involved. Now, again, that model can work well for some people who either are unable to be involved or don't have the time, etc. But for those who are looking for more involvement, that's not really allowed for in that sort of model as well. And again, there are varying levels even within that. So some that are in the provider governance have minimal, if any, input. Others have more, albeit informal. So it really depends on who you're working with. The middle one, which is what we call it, because this is the model that Fighting Chance operates under, but the middle one is what's called facilitated family governance. And that's trying to take, I guess, the best of both worlds. So here we're trying to put in place, a family governance committee that's made up of the housemates and their families and all persons responsible. You have choice and control. All decisions around who gets hired and fired and that sort of stuff are made there. Financial decisions are made. There's open and transparency in terms of the financials of how the house has been operated, etc. Yet at the same time, the organisation takes on the back end, so all the administrative stuff. So the Family Governance Committee meets once a month or every 6 weeks or so, depending on what they want to do. And then all the back end stuff around the financial, the tax, HR, all that sort of thing is taken care of by the organisation. And generally, then there's a fee charged for that, which sort of comes out of the SIL, and that's how any of the providers will normally do, because there's an amount around about 30% that's allowed for within what we can charge from the NDIS that goes to the provider to cover off on the costs of running the operation. And again, there's not as many providers providing that middle section, and there are some variations to that as well. So, but that gives you a bit of an idea across the board of the main ways in which SIL is operating.
Thank you, Brent. Ali, before we go on to the next one, is there any questions up until this point in the chat?
Yeah, we had a question from Susan. Susan's asked, can you apply for SIL in mainstream housing?
I can take that if you like, Alex.
Yep.
If essentially you're talking about getting SIL and then having it in your own house or in a rental, for example, Yes, SIL is not about and I think it's going to get covered a bit later, but it's not about the actual building. SIL is only about the actual supports that are required. So as long as you're eligible for SIL funding, we have currently a couple of houses where the families essentially are renting a place off the market, and we then provide SIL services into that house to support their people. So yeah, certainly from that perspective, I guess that answers the question, hopefully. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a great question.
Any others?
That was all that's come through the chat, but if anyone wants to jump off mute and ask anything now. All good. We can move on to the next section.
So the next type of support is another NDIS support that we will talk about, and that is individualized living options. This is a fairly new option that's been available the past couple of years, and it essentially is it's quite miscellaneous. So the individualized living option is support that helps you live your in your chosen home environment in the best way that suits you. It's not the home itself, so same as supported independent living. And just so you know, this is how we've set it up. With on the right hand side where it says support, these three options are just people, the people support, and on the left hand side are either assistive tech, the home itself, or modifications to the home. So that's where, so it's the housing side. So that's where, and some people can have both, as you can see with the arrow lines, and some people just have funding or eligibility for one. So yeah, the individualized living option is quite miscellaneous, and there are lots and lots of choices, including a mix of both formal and informal supports. It is it can also be an option that if someone has home and living funding, and it's not enough for them to have supported independent living 7 days a week, and they may not need it to that degree, using an ILO provider where they can have drop-in supports or a support model that works for them is can be ideal. So there is, and very much it is about that there are two stages. So very much that first stage is about exploring and designing the individualized living option, finding a provider that is able to provide that level of support that is needed and to provide that model of support that's needed. So some people live at home and then they have drop-in supports, or some people, and so they might live with their partner, or they might live with someone who isn't on the NDIS and doesn't have a disability, but then they may not need support 24/7, but still they're able to have the level of support that they need. So exploring that with the occupational therapist and with providers, and with ILO providers, and with informal supports, and also the support coordinator helps with that designing stage. And then the second stage is the support to put those in place. So and that is sort of the how and where you want to live and what you need to do that. So again, like SIL, they don't include supports for activities outside the home, such as work or study, playing sport, or going out. With SIL though, if it is like they're going to something, sport or an activity on the weekend, or going to a birthday party or something, if they're using the support from in the home out in the community, then yes, that can be sort of covered. But if it's an activity outside the home or something like that, then ILO does not cover that. The next option that we're going to talk about is SDA, or specialist disability accommodation. And some people find that they have eligibility for SDA and then supported independent living, or SDA and ILO, or SDA and flexible core supports. It just depends on what the person's what's most appropriate for that individual. And NDIA don't always get it right, which is why it sometimes ends up at the NDI at the AAT. But specialist disability accommodation is essentially the bricks and mortar. It's the home itself, and it is designed for people with significant functional impairment, and require a home to be designed and modified for their needs. It does not include the staff in the home. And some people just need the home modified, and then they're able to be independent. But other people need the home modified, like significantly modified and designed for them. And then they also need the support to come into the home. Brett, do you want to talk about these 4 different housing categories? It pretty much is just the level of funding that a person can get. But Brett, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So as Alex said, this is the bricks and mortar. So when you go through this, you get separate funding to a separate bucket from the NDIS, which goes directly to pay for your accommodation or your rent in one of these types of buildings. And the way that they allocate these is across 4 different categories. And I guess they go from less complex to higher complex or higher needs, however you like to just explain it. So the improved livability is obviously the lower level of funding, and is, I guess, for people who, well, have need some additional physical access features in the house. They have enhanced provision for people with sensory or intellectual or cognitive impairment. So again, yeah, there may be some relative independence there and ability to operate independently, but have some physical access issues, which the house is designed then to assist with. And that's the point. It's not about the SIL at this point or the independent services. They may not even have SIL, and you could still live in an improved livability house because the house is designed to that level. Mm-hmm. The second level is what they call fully accessible. So, and obviously that speaks for itself. It's incorporating a higher level of physical access provision. So if you have a significant physical impairment, and that obviously goes from everything from ramps to lifts to other assistive technology. So
wider doorways.
Yeah, widened doorways, other AT assisted technology where you might have, cupboards that come down, benches that go up, doors that open automatically, whatever it might be. Again, you could even be living in one of those houses totally independently without actual support, but the house is now fully accessible for you to get in and operate independently. But then you also may be living there with SIL, because with part of that, you might also need some personal support. So that's fully accessible. The third one there is robust. Again, sort of it describes what it is, and that's generally for those participants, housemates who might have some other behavioural behaviours of concern or challenges in those areas which require the house to be a little bit more robust. It might be everything from sound, additional sound. The robust model generally has additional soundproofing, double glazing on windows to help with sound across to neighbours and so forth, and also coming back in for those who may be sensitive and triggered by sound. And then tougher walls and whatever else, and other design features in it that assist to work to that more robust level. And then the last one is the high physical support. So that's sort of a combination of the fully accessible. So it's got all the fully accessible features, but then goes to an additional area where you might then find things such as hoists in place, much larger bathrooms and all that, and change tables, whatever it might be that's required to assist the person who has a lot higher level of not just physical access, but then personal care supports as well. I think does that cover everything for you there, Alex?
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
So I'll just quickly go through the, essentially this is just a visual to essentially, to show people who are eligible. So extreme functional impairment, very high support needs. If they've previously lived in an SDA, or they, or like in their, mobility, self-care and self-management, and need very high, I mean, person-to-person supports would be SIL, but if they require that really, like, I would more be looking at it for if they really require that really high physical support by having a modified home, but not just one part of the home, like the whole home, then the SDA assessment criteria, which is essentially assessed by the occupational therapist. This is just another, I know it's very small, but we will send it to you in as a resource. But this again talks about the model and the eligibility there as well. I didn't do it for the SIL, and I should have done that, but with SDA and also home modifications, this is where you would see the funding. But for SIL, ILO, and increased core supports, that you'll see that in the core budget, and it generally is explained on this left-hand side of the plan, what it's for, but if there is there's typically more flexibility in the plans these days to use the funding for home supports and funding for community supports quite flexibly within each other, the way that it typically is for a plan without home and living supports. But SDA comes in here, and you will see it. There's been the eligibility. That person's been found eligible for SDA for the robust. For the robust, and they've said one resident and where the location is, which matters because the different locations cost different things. But it's up to this amount, the 55,000, but they're going to need to provide a quote from the SDA provider before that funding is released. But it's essentially sitting behind the plan on the system and will be released once the quote's provided. So the next, Ali, is there any questions around SDA?
Yes, we did have a question from Wendy around the different categories of supports. She has asked, does anyone ever get approval for improved livability? Does that get funded?
It does. It just needs, so the NDIA are really reliant on the occupational therapy housing report, but they still will, at the end of the day, make their own home and living decision. And so even though it might be that the OT requests recommends the improved livability, it may not necessarily be funded. But what I would encourage is ensuring that the OT is really, really clear on, because it is a tricky one to, like, fully accessible, robust and high physical supports. They are definitely the most common ones. Improved livability is a harder one to get funded. However, it's not impossible. It's just about ensuring that the occupational therapist really understands that option and ensures that the functional information that's in the report really outlines why that person is needing that when it comes down to that recommendation. But it definitely does get funded, just not very often. I don't see that being funded very often, to be completely honest, but I have seen it be funded. So the next bit that we're going to talk about is assistive tech. So some people, and I also want to say that the NDIA, and we're going to talk about this in a bit, but the NDIA, there are a lot of changes happening. I'm just doing a time check. There are a lot of changes happening in the NDIA, and they are really pushing for more assistive tech in the homes. Whether it's a SIL home, an individualized living options home, a flexible core support home, they're really pushing assistive tech to ensure, to see if they can reduce the amount of like person-to-person support in the home, because that's obviously going to reduce costs, and it's going to improve that person's independence as well. So that does need to be explored, and if it's not an option, that's totally fine, but it does need to be explored. Assistive tech may be what a person needs, and they may have a specialist disability accommodation, assistive tech, and supported independent living, or like they may have mainstream housing options, assistive tech, and SIL. Like there's lots of options for you to kind of combine the housing and support. So it's essentially needs to assistive tech typically is put in place to support a person's independence and to support a person's functional capacity. May be needed in combination with other options, but it may be all the individual requires to live independently. So they might be able to live in a mainstream housing option with assistive technology. There are different levels of assistive tech, and the mid cost is a new one, but there's essentially the low cost, which is the most common one that people get funded. Items under $1,500, they're the off-the-shelf items, typically not items that are modified or anything, and they're included as part of the core budget. So no further evidence is technically required. However, I am finding with the clients I work with that more and more plan managers and the NDIA are requesting a supporting letter along with the quote. So it just depends on the plan manager, but I am finding it's sort of a bit 50-50 at the moment. So we might be pushing more towards it does need evidence. The medium cost is between $1,500 and $5,000. So it typically needs a recommendation letter, and it will be included as part of the capital budget, but it will be sitting there as available funds. High cost is items above $5,000, and they typically require specialist support to assess, fit, and monitor use, and they require a full assessment and AT application to be completed by either a physio or an occupational therapist, and that needs prior approval before being built into the plan. There's obviously like-for-like replacement, so that's for wear and tear, broken beyond repair, dangerous to use, or outgrown. Quote and supporting letter from therapist is required. The next one that we're going to talk about is home modification. And some people, this is the other thing that I want to say when it comes to home modifications or assistive technology, especially if it's that higher cost and the therapist has put in a justification. If they are putting in a justification for assistive tech or home modifications, and part of their justification is the person can remain living at home longer, or they can live independently longer with this support, you are unlikely in the short term after getting that approved to get one of these home and living supports approved. Unless something dramatically changes, you are unlikely. If nothing changes and it's just been a change of mind, I would suggest not going ahead with the home modification if it hasn't started, and going for one of the other, like going back to the OT about one of the other options. But really exploring all the options at that point with the OT is really important, because the NDIA will see it as a way to save costs by funding the home modification, and they like that justification. But if then the person comes back 3 months later and they've got, a brand new bathroom through the NDIA, and then they say, no, I want to move out now, they're going to be like, no, not without like clear evidence that, it's there's been some unforeseen change. So that's just really important to keep in mind. So the NDIS offers reasonable and necessary funding for home modifications to access the place, like whether it's access the home or access outside or access the bathroom or the kitchen or somewhere, to help improve independence and facilitate the activities of daily living. The primary focus is the person's bedroom, living area, meal area, and bathroom. And I would say also laundry is important there. And also entry and exiting of the home, but typically that can be funded through assistive tech with a ramp or something like that. It may not need full home modifications unless it's a really big change to the property. So now I'm going to move on to how to get assessed and funded supports. Essentially, I have touched on this a little bit, but if you feel NDIS funded supports will be needed, so you may have tried, and I do encourage this, to try different options, because it's going to give, obviously, to not going out and, you know, buying a home and then trying and seeing that not work, not to that sort of cost, but if there is a way of doing things like short-term accommodation, or previously known as respite, to test out how it works with different supports or different assistive tech, because that gives really good evidence. But if you've identified that funded supports, or the therapist has identified that funded supports will be needed, a request of a review, either through a change of situation or scheduled reassessment, it needs to be requested. At the plan reassessment meeting, ensure that there is a home and living goal in your plan. It doesn't need to be short term, but I would encourage it to be. But it can be a medium or long term goal, depending on what the other goals are. But you can, if it's short term, then it's really saying that, you know, I really want to push this in the next plan period. And then you want to be requesting funding to explore housing options. This will give you funding for reports, mainly the funding for occupational therapy, housing, home and living report. It can give you, if relevant, it can give you funding to trial short-term accommodation and funding for a support coordinator. I would encourage you to request this, and I'll explain why in a minute. At this point, you don't need to tell the NDIA planner or LAC which option, as you have not been assessed. So if you're going in for a plan reassessment, you wouldn't say, I need to explore SIL support, like I need to explore that, only that one option. You would say, I need to explore housing options, because that includes all of the options, and you're not specifying it to one because you haven't been assessed yet. If you have been assessed and you've got a home and living report, then, but you don't have a support coordinator, and you want to sort of, and you want to explore the home and living options, you can put in for eligibility, and I'll tell you about the process in a bit, but it becomes a little bit tricky then, because the other half of what the NDIA are relying on, which is this home and living report, which we'll share in the resources, it can be filled out by a family member or by someone, but there is quite a lot of weight in it, and I would really encourage it coming from a support coordinator, or really help it having the support of the occupational therapist, because you want to get the wording right in that, because there is quite a lot of weight in it. So you can kind of go part the way and then ask for funding for more, but it does become a little bit more clunky, because if you're submitting the home and living form, they're going to get confused, and then they're going to see that you're putting in for eligibility, and if you don't have all the other reports, then it potentially won't happen. So once you have the funding to explore the options, then the first thing is you want to get a functional capacity assessment for home and living purposes. And the reason for that is because they will assess all of the options, both NDIS and mainstream, and then you can get a better idea of what needs to be explored further. I would also encourage spending time away from the family home, and this helps to provide evidence to the NDIA of what works and does not work, and it also helps the OT, because it can give really clear evidence to support with the justification as to why certain supports don't work and why certain supports do. So I would say that the best thing is using the core budget under short-term accommodation, and I would encourage requesting this at the time of requesting funding to explore home and living options. The support coordinator, assuming you have one, otherwise I would say sit with your OT or someone who knows the NDIA very well to help to complete the home and living form. And if it's specialist disability accommodation, then there's another form, and it's an individualized housing options form, and that needs to be written as well, and that one is quite comprehensive in the details of the evidence, and so I would encourage, again, the support coordinator or someone who knows the NDIA well to help you to fill that out. Number 4 is all reports and evidence are submitted for a home and living decision. And this is to be made by the home and living team. Now, just a little note there as well. The home and living team is separate to a typical planner or LAC that is assessing the rest of the budget. So if you're going just for the home and living decision, but nothing else is, you're not going to have any, like, it reviewed for any other parts of your plan, then just put in for the home and living supporting evidence. So the forms or the reports and any additional reports, and the home and living form, or with SDA, the additional housing form, that to be submitted, and it to be sort of really clear that it is to be sent to the home and living team for a decision on eligibility. But if you're wanting to review the whole plan, then you would need to have the meeting to let them know that, because it's not all going to be assessed by the home and living team. It's 2 separate things. And the home and living decision can take a few months. So you might get a plan with the rest of the supports changed before you get the home and living funding. Essentially what happens is, once you've met eligibility, it used to be that you would get contacted and be told that you met eligibility and explained what you met eligibility for. And then you would submit what's called the roster of care. But that is not the process anymore. The roster of care used to be used very much by home and living providers, mainly SIL providers, before ILO was a sort of a thing, SIL providers putting together that, because it's set out as 24/7, and then it calculates an amount, and that was submitted to the NDIA as essentially a quote, and then the funding was built in. Now what we're seeing is, if someone gets eligibility, they'll get a new plan with home and living funding built straight in to the plan. And then you can go back to the provider that you may have been talking to, and say, this is how much funding I have. Can we make this work, or is it not going to work? And if it's not going to work, then it would be going through the review process, which is the same as any other review process, as in the same process of requesting that. So you'll then, so once you've submitted it all, it can take a few months, and then you'll receive a letter explaining the decision. And they'll also explain why they've declined it, if they've declined it. You'll receive a new plan with the funding built into it. And then you can contact a housing provider. I do encourage, when you're exploring housing options, you to speak and inquire about the different models, or the different providers that are out there, or get your support coordinator to help you with that. So you sort of have an idea, and then when the funding comes in, you can then go and speak with them further to say, this is how much funding. But a lot of providers will say, come back to us when we've got the funding, because the NDIA are quite unpredictable. And if it says the OT report says that there's funding there, then it doesn't always actually. I mean, it recommended like if an OT recommends a level of support, the funding isn't always matching that. If unhappy with the decision, you can go through an internal review process. If nothing changes, then there is the option of going to AAT. So I'm just going to go through, I'm very conscious of time, but I just want to go through some recent changes in the home and living support space in the NDIA. And I want to make a note as well that there is a new home and living policy that is coming out, and I would encourage keeping an eye out on the NDIS website. And I find NDIS website and also DSC are very reliable sources for information. I find there's a lot of websites out there, but they don't update their information. But the NDIS website is actually very, very up to date. So go there first. But some of the recent changes that we're already seeing is that the roster of care templates for SIL are being used by providers and individuals to work out the schedule of support and ratios for the individual, but the NDIA are no longer using it as a quote to fund to that amount for the individual. It doesn't mean you can't submit it with everything else as a bit of a guide, but just so you know, just because the roster of care is saying a certain amount, the NDIA are no longer building to that, the way that they would build to if you sent in a wheelchair quote with a report, and they would fund to exactly that amount if they approved it. The NDIA are still finding people eligible, but they're not funding to that amount. Home and living funding, ILO and SIL amounts are being put in flexibly to the core budget, so this can be utilised as a whole amount or between social and community and in-home support amounts, depending on the needs of the individual. Home and living reports that used to only be written by the support coordinator can be written by a family member or someone close to the individual. And we will include, when we put all of this up on the website, on the Fighting Chance website, we'll include all these resources, which will have all of these forms there as well. There have been a lot of reductions in funding in the home and living space, which is putting a lot of pressure on providers to be able to provide the support that's needed. So a lot more flexibility is needed to think about how to make the funding work. And so when exploring with home and living providers, mainly SIL and ILO providers, not so much SDA providers, but mainly SIL and ILO providers, there needs to be that level of flexibility when exploring that. The NDIA want to see assistive tech and capacity building supports to build independence being thoroughly explored to help the reduction of home and living costs in an individual's plan, or to be included so it can if it is an option, to then be included in the plan so it can reduce the sort of person-to-person care support, because that's going to reduce the overall cost for the agency. Some key things to think about if starting the home and living process. Home and living funding doesn't pay for rent. So how will you pay for this? A lot of people use their DSP, disability support pension, if they're not working. So applying for this, if you meet the eligibility criteria for the DSP, is encouraged. There's also rental assistance through Centrelink, so ensuring everything is registered for that. There are some other programs like Commonwealth programs and stuff that can be explored too. If support is being provided by family members, as in financial support, how will this be sustained long term? We don't want to say it, but we're all not going to be here forever. And so how can that be sustained long term? Because these home and living options and moving in, and if the family is paying the mortgage or the rent or something like that, that needs to be able to be continued. Otherwise, the individual living there is going to be in a bit of in a bit of a pickle if that money isn't there long term. So is guardianship for living needed? And if so, going through that process. NDIS do not fund daily costs like bills and food. So how will this be paid? And if looking to rent privately, considering the area and the cost of living, rental prices in that area. A lot of people, especially a lot of people that come through Fighting Chance or live on the Northern Beaches and want to remain living on the Northern Beaches, as just an example, but the Northern Beaches are so expensive. So you find that there's a lot of SIL homes and SDA homes out west or in those cheaper areas for that reason, because the cost is a lot. It's not impossible to find SIL and SDA homes on the Northern Beaches, but it is a lot more common out west for the reason of it being a lot cheaper. Just a final note before we go to the final questions, and just I am on, like, we're almost on time. It's important to note that this is a lengthy process, and so to go in being prepared that it is a lengthy process. So it can take over 12 months. So not getting frustrated with the process because or with the providers, because it is quite lengthy. So starting the process with good time rather than leaving it till it is urgent is preferred. However, we can't always predict that what the future holds. So sometimes this is unavoidable, but if it is avoidable, then I would encourage exploring that option as early as possible. For medium-term accommodation funding to be put in a person's plan, they need to have a move-in date for their home and living option. Short-term accommodation is 28 days, and then it turns into medium-term accommodation. So if the person can no longer live at home and needs to go into medium-term accommodation, the NDIA, it's not absolutely impossible to get, but the NDIA are quite strict with saying that if the person is in medium-term accommodation, they have to have a move-in date for their long-term accommodation option. So for their SIL or ILO or SDA option, they need to have a move-in date, which can be very tricky and not always very practical. But I find that the NDIA can really push back. So if you're finding that there's a bit of a pushback there, that's why. And I would encourage to still keep pushing back on them, but you can find that it can be a little bit challenging. So that is all my talking. Are there any questions before we finish up tonight?
So I think you've answered all the ones that came in through the chat as you've been through, which is great to see. So I guess just if anyone has any more questions that they haven't put in the chat or anything they'd like to add, to either pop it in the chat now or to jump off mute, whichever one you feel more comfortable with.
I also wanted to add something because we didn't talk about this, but I did want to verbally add it with the flexible core support option. So some people don't need as much funding for supported independent that you get for supported independent living or ILO, but having just an increase in their core budget will allow enough funding for them to live either in a mainstream option or in an SDA, or live in a mainstream option with assistive tech and then some flexible core supports. So that's just an increase in what the current sort of situation is in terms of support in the home. So again, that is support, increased core supports is in the home environment, not in the community. Sorry, Alan. Yeah, anyone can go off mute if there's any questions. Otherwise, we will finish up for tonight. But I do have a longer PowerPoint where I'm have more words that will be used as a resource on the website too. It was very wordy for me to present, but it can be helpful to read a lot of the information. All right, then, if no one has any questions, then we might finish for tonight. Thanks everyone for coming. And if you think of anything, I know it was a lot of information, then definitely flick through a question, or are there questions coming through? Oh no, it's thank you. You are very welcome. And yeah, if there's any questions, please flick them through. And also, if there are any topics that you guys want to hear more about in the NDIS space, we're really open to hearing what people in the community are wanting to hear about, and we can do a webinar on that. All right, well, thanks guys, and good night everyone. Thank you so much, Brett, for coming.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.
Oh, I better stop sharing and I better stop recording. Where do I stop recording? Stop recording. There we go.